Let's talk fertility rates. Let's talk fertility rates. It's not just you. No one wants kids anymore by fads. I've reacted to fads here and there. Interesting. Just wait for the next 30, 40 years and then you see this racist inbred still exists. Who knows? Who knows? Here we go. Here we go. My opinion is, for once, there's money-wise, right? Financially, it's not worth it to have children. And also, societally, there is a lot of change, right? Even if you give people financial incentive, they still won't have that many children. Reason being is that having families is demonized.
The US fertility rate drops to another historic low. Births in Japan hit record low. Italy's national birth rate is declared a national emergency. Nearly every country is due to shrink by 2100. There's little to no doubt that there's like an ongoing fertility crisis. People are choosing to not have babies anymore. From South Korea to the United States to Norway to Taiwan, pretty much every rich country. And you might not think this is a problem, but it is a problem for a few reasons. The reality is that people are living longer than ever at the moment. When people start to live this...
Yep. This only affects countries that have a lot of money. This only affects... It can't... See... It only affects countries that have a rich lifestyle, if you want to call it that. Whether you're rich in that system, that's another story. But yeah.
It's long. You need new workers to replace the ones that are retiring. You need new workers to pay taxes that will eventually fund the pensions of those who retire. And you need young people in the workforce to take care of those older people. In the 1960s, there were 6 people of working age for every retired person. And by 2035, it's expected to be 2 to 1. This is one of those topics where if you ask 5 different people, you'll get 5 completely different answers as to what the reason.
I'm gonna straight up say I won't be retiring. I can say this with most confidence that I will not be retiring. I will not be retiring. If you don't get into the position where you get a private retirement fund, you are fucked. I will not be retiring.
People tend to have quite strong opinions. Some people might say it's a cost of living issue. Some people might say that it's to do with declining rates of religion in the world. Some people might blame women's liberation movements, for
It might be all of the combined. It might be all of the combined.
example. Either way, no matter what people say, they're typically pretty certain that either their experience or their belief is the reason why on a global scale people aren't having children. I think we can do better than that, because when I see that there's a problem that is affecting Norway, the US, Taiwan, and France, I tell myself that there's got to be like a better answer that we can give, right? Because these countries are completely different. The childcare situation, for example, in Norway is vastly different to the childcare situation in the US, which is vastly different to the UK. So I feel like we can get a better answer than just this one-line solution of, oh, it's the cost of living. I think we can do better. If you'd asked me, to be honest, like even just a couple of weeks ago, I would have put the blame squarely on the cost of housing. In fact, there's this one chart that lives like in my head rent-free.
Yeah, a main I would say a big portion is the cost of living. I cannot afford a house. I'm in the generation that cannot afford a house. We'll never afford a house. That's just the rough truth. And my fiance wants we want to have 4 children. That's gonna be rough. And I'm in the privileged position where my parents have a house big enough where that is possible. Others don't have that.
It's a chart that compares the growth of house prices to the growth of incomes in the UK. And intuitively, to me, it feels like that's why people wouldn't want to have kids. And to a lot of people, it feels that way. But I want to challenge my intuition, and maybe we can reach a more nuanced answer as to why this is.
Though I also have to say that a lot of the poverty that happens, a lot of people that get into poverty, a big reason why these people enter poverty or don't have money is because they were never taught how to use money. They have an issue that I call, I have no money, yet I must spend. The problem is that there's a lot of people who don't have an income problem, they have a spending problem, and they would live much better if they would actually spend their money on things that they actually would need. For Poga, what's the salary of the teacher in Germany? Yeah, it's gonna be rough. It's gonna be rough. I gotta make it somehow.
Is more of a global problem than necessarily a specific localized problem. For example, this is a piece of research from the US, which tried to establish what the effect of a $10,000 increase in housing would be on people's decision to have kids. Unsurprisingly, if house prices go up, it corresponds to a 2.4% drop in the decision to have kids if you are renting. However, if you own your home, you actually become more likely to have kids as house prices go up. The net effect of this is that when house prices go up in the US, more people actually want to have kids, which is really counterintuitive. But there is some variance.
Oh, interesting. So it can't be the housing. And I'm assuming Frog will also work. No, she wants to be a housewife.
Because in the UK, the effect of increasing house prices is a net decrease. And this is just one piece of evidence that immediately helps us understand that we can't just think of this problem as a one-line solution. Clearly, housing can't explain the full picture. I think the cost of having children is another huge factor that people typically fall back on when they explain the reasons why people aren't having kids. It's too expensive. However, it seems that even paying people to have kids isn't working very well. Taiwan spent...
Obviously, yes. Yes. It could be very much a cultural issue. Like I said, there is a great attempt at annihilating the nuclear family. There's a great attempt at annihilating families in general, which I have noticed, and many others have noticed. So I think it is also due to propaganda reasons. I'm gonna straight up call it propaganda because that's what it is. Because then you can invite people into your country, right? You can get a bunch of immigrants who will work for less than the native population. That is just also something I've noticed.
More than $3 billion trying to get its citizens to have more children, and it's had no success at all. In France, they've spent even more money, about 4% of their GDP, on various measures to encourage people to have children. To put this into perspective, if the US spent 4% of its GDP on family measures, that would be the equivalent of the entire defense budget. So countries are actually, some countries at least, are actually spending a huge amount of money on things like tax breaks, things like direct cash transfers, and things like childcare benefits to encourage people to have kids. So clearly there's a bit more to this whole situation than meets the eye initially. And I think we can maybe look at some of the research and evidence, because there is a whole body of research and evidence to engage with. And I've tried to find the best bits to share it with you. And I'm curious to hear what your opinions are on these different aspects. What I do find really interesting is like how the narrative has changed around this topic, because a couple of decades ago, overpopulation was all the rage. All of the discussion around the number of people on Earth.
The problem is that the overpopulation issue is not a European or US issue. The overpopulation issue is an Asia and Africa issue. We have no overpopulation in Europe. We have no overpopulation in the US. We have a overpopulation issue in Africa, in India, in those places. Other Asian countries likely as well.
Revolved around the fact that there were too many people, and we have two people to blame for this. First of all, we have this dude here. His name is Thomas Malthus, and he is an 18th century economist, and he was the first major figure to really write about this idea of a population boom. He saw that the quality of life in 18th century England was dropping pretty quickly, and he said that there was just too many people and that we'd get to a point where there wouldn't be enough food to sustain the growing population. And a couple of decades later, another professor wrote about the same topic. His name was Paul Ehrlich, and he wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And people really believed them. To kind of put into perspective how scared people were of overpopulation, I want to share a quote by the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the US, who said that overpopulation could be more explosive than the atomic or hydrogen bomb. Even on the other side of the world, in China, these fears of overpopulation promoted China's decision to implement their
the one-child policy, which generally fucked the country up for generations to come, because, oh well, surprise, surprise, they didn't go the way what they wanted it, because now they have an aging population and not enough children.
child policy, the whole package of laws and regulations designed to stop Chinese people from having more than one child. If we fast forward to today, those fears were like clearly unfounded. I think most of us understand that food insecurity is a distribution problem and not an agriculture problem. And instead, we've ended up in the situation where underpopulation is the problem, where there are not enough young people. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the US specifically, because I think they've got some really interesting factors that paint a different picture of the fertility crisis to the one that you might have in your head at the moment. This is a graph of the US fertility.
Also remember that 28% of our generation, right? Us Zoomers, 28% of us were aborted. The more you know.
Rates, and it's the kind of graph that makes you want to jump to a specific conclusion or a one-line answer as to what's going on here. But the real interesting part of this graph isn't what it looks like now, it's what it looks like when you kind of break it down by demographics. And thankfully, The Economist has done this for me. If we look at birth rate divided by age, we see some really interesting trends. Somewhat surprisingly, the fertility rate amongst women over 30 has actually been steadily rising since the 1990s. However, you might see something else that's quite interesting. Birth rates amongst 15 to 19-year-old women in the US dropped dramatically. The actual figure is 77%. And they actually explain that more than half of the drop in America's total fertility rate is driven by women under 19 choosing to no longer have kids. Around a third of these births would have been unplanned, and the majority of these births would have been on low incomes as well. In the UK, we actually see a similar trend where women at age 20 are having half as many children. Unlike richer women, these young women are not going to compensate by having more kids in the future. And I actually want to take a brief second to have a little aside and talk about the fact that often the most vilified group of people are actually the most important group of people to society. I'm sure you've heard young single mothers described as a burden on society or as lazy. But clearly these women were actually like the backbone of the economy. It's an aspect that I feel many people don't actually think about. Obviously, it would be unreasonable to...
But obviously, there also come a problem with single motherhood. There is no deniability that single mothers have worse outcomes when it comes to their kids, more crime, bigger failures in schools, raising single mothers themselves. Now, are the single mothers completely follow this? No, the men should stay if they can. If they're not committing crime or anything, obviously. But also, women should make more conscious decisions on who, first of all, they're going to sleep with and who they're going to marry. Like, be a bit more careful. The fuck are you doing?
Say that the reason that no one is having kids is purely because teen pregnancies are down. The economic aspect of it is clearly important. It's clearly relevant. I don't think it's a coincidence if you look in this graph that the countries that have the lowest fertility rate in Europe, countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece, are also the countries with the highest youth unemployment, the countries where young people live with their parents for the longest, and the economy is in the bin, basically. And if you just ask young adults why they're not having kids, a lot of them will say that it's simply because childcare is too expensive. What I do find interesting, though, is that the fertility crisis is one that affects the whole world, and it affects countries that spend an incredible amount of money on social programs for kids. So this is a quote by Robert Reich. If you don't know who Robert Reich is, he was US Secretary of Labor. He says that Norway spends around $30,000 per child on early childhood care. Finland spends $23,000. Germany spends $18,000. And the US spends $500 per child. Obviously, the US has a huge childcare spending problem. It just doesn't want to invest in...
Ironically enough, those 18,000s, you don't see those anywhere because they're not really, right? You have to pay for, getting to kindergarten and shit, right? Here in Germany, at least. And most people cannot afford that. And second of all, there's not even enough slots to put your kid in. So, well, that's another reason.
Young children. But Norway, which is...
I need to work. Who's taking care of the child? Yes, nobody.
Spending incredible amounts on early childhood care, is still seeing a below replacement birth rate. And when we talk about this problem, we tend to lump men and women in together as if their experience of having children is identical, when there are actually some pretty significant differences that can at least help us explain some more of the trend towards choosing to not have children. And one of these big factors is the fact that women's earnings drop significantly after having a child. And that drop persists decades after they have children. This is not so much of a problem for men. Men who choose to have kids don't earn significantly less than men who don't choose to have kids. And they don't also experience a short-term drop in the amount that they earn. Gender-based differences in terms of the experience of childcare, I think are a remarkably important factor because ultimately you need two people to have a child. This tracks with the work of...
The problem is, how do you fix that? Because one of them has to stay at home. One of them has... You could switch it up, sure. But the outcome would be worse. There's a harsh truth to be learned, and that is that women don't go into jobs that pay as much. Right? That's a big problem. So the reason why it doesn't drop for men is because men don't need to drop out of the workforce. And if they do, they usually... Like, if they have to, then usually they would make less than the woman to begin with. Therefore, it's not really worth it. Right? There's a truth to be said that men just make more because they choose different jobs.
Dr. Matthias Dupke, he's like the guy to talk about family economics. It's his like area of specialty. He talks at length about the differences between low fertility countries and ultra low fertility countries. In the countries that have the lowest levels of fertility, there is a clear trend of women taking on a greater percentage of the burden of childcare. So in the really low fertility countries, the percentage of childcare duties that is taken on by women can be as high as 80%. In countries that have slightly better fertility ratios, this percentage is much closer to 50-50. There's still a huge stigma in some of these countries, particularly South Korea and Japan, where women are still expected to spend huge amounts of time at home taking care of children, but they can't survive without having a career, or they simply just want a career, which is also very reasonable. The decision to have kids is, in some extent, a signal of optimism, right? A signal in the belief that you'll have a good future, your kid will have a good future, and the world on the whole has a good future ahead of it. And I think these disparate factors all play into a single idea of optimism about the world. There's a really good research group called Our World in Data. They're amazing. They compiled some data on how optimistic people feel about the world. And you can see that there's this concentration of rich, low fertility countries at the bottom of this graph. And I think it helps us at least explain somewhat why the countries that are even trialing just direct one-off cash payments are not seeing remarkable improvement. Giving someone a one-off payment doesn't necessarily make them feel like the world is going to be a better place in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
I feel like that if you want to have like some success, the harsh truth is that you need to drop taxes significantly once somebody has a child, and then drop taxes again when somebody has a child. Not just like a one-time... Of course, a one-time payment is not going to save... is not going to change anything, right? It's a one-time payment. What do you do like the next time? Nothing. A one-time payment is pointless. What you need to do is like drop taxes for a prolonged period of time.
On the other hand, places like Taiwan have tried extended maternity leave, and that hasn't worked because that has actually increased the risk for women. They're going to be out of the workforce for longer, and they're going to struggle to recover the income that they once had. There are these macro factors like the gender wage gap, which are kind of creating like a negative pressure, and it's not enough to buy.
The problem is that there's no gender wage gap. There's no gender wage gap. The gender wage gap, for example, here in Germany is like barely 2%. It's like 2 to 6%, and it's not due to not getting paid the same. It's the it's like 0 to 6% actually. Because here you need to pay the same because otherwise you can get sued. It's, for example, that the pay gap really just comes down, the overall pay gap really comes down to job choices. That is the main issue. But if you get the same job and the same position, you won't make less, at least here. So that cannot be an explanation to why the birth rate is dropping here.
Balance that negative pressure. But importantly, it's also worth mentioning that a lot of the drop in fertility is actually a good thing. It represents that people have agency. People can actually choose whether or not to have children, especially women. In fact, we use the term fertility crisis when it's not really a fertility crisis, it's a worker crisis. Governments aren't trying to create self-actualized, happy, positive individuals.
The problem is that Scandinavia, as one of the most happy happy regions, is also the one taking the most antidepressants, so that can't be the solution. When we look at you can call it a worker crisis, but it will be a fertility crisis because, well, without workers, you will run into a lot of problems. A lot of the government support systems are based on taxpayers. Without taxpayers, it becomes a crisis because how are you going to afford healthcare when it usually actually is free? Like, I will experience our healthcare system completely collapsing. That thing will be gone. I give it 10 years and then everyone has to pay their own healthcare. That's going to happen. We're going to implement the same system as the US because that shit's fucking dying. How are you going to pay a pension? How are you going to pay a retirement? That is for example, here it's a generational contract. Without more people, no retirement. Which is what I'm saying. I won't be retiring. That won't be happening because there's no people. And oddly enough, right, with all the immigration, right, the fertility rate should technically increase, right? Again, it doesn't. What does that tell us? The people that come here and immigrate into countries don't have children either. It's like an infinite loop. Everything you do fails. And in addition to that, I also feel like there's a lot of anti-family propaganda. You can see this in media, right? The guy's a bumbling fool. Always, like, dads are really badly portrayed in media. It's horrible. Obviously, that's going to have some effect.
They're trying to create meat for the grinder.
You need the meat for the grinder because otherwise, you will be meat for the grinder even longer. That's the problem. If you don't provide meat for the grinder, you're gonna be meat for the grinder longer. They're trying to push working until 73 here. Imagine you go into a job at like 16, right? Which can happen, right? You start an apprenticeship at 16 and you're gonna work until 73. Yeah. Smart. Longer the grinder. You are just in the grinder for longer then if you don't have children. That's literally what you're gonna get. Anyways, like, comment, and subscribe.